You're conducting a review and you come across an email. It just says the director approved the payment by phone. At first glance, it looks like a perfectly documented authorization. But if you're in the middle of a serious corporate investigation, relying on that single message, well, it could actually cause your entire evidence trail to collapse. Let's look at why. Okay, let's dive into this. If an email says your director approved a payment by phone, do you actually have their approval? Or do you just have a story about one? Are we looking at a verified corporate control? Or are we simply reading a narrative about a control? This question is the absolute foundation of digital forensics, because when informal conversations become the basis for moving money or signing contracts or filing regulatory documents, we are operating on secondary reports. Section 1. The governance blind spot. This brings us to a structural vulnerability that hides in plain sight inside almost every corporate network. It's the space between a decision happening and our ability to actually prove that it happened. Look, when an employee writes, "I spoke with the manager, he approved the payment," human nature tends to just accept the assumption. We assume the manager approved it. But the forensic reality is much narrower. The evidence only establishes that an employee reported an approval at that specific moment in time. The email doesn't independently establish who actually participated in the call, or whether the caller's identity was properly authenticated, or what exact dollar amount was discussed. It can't tell us if there were conditions attached, or if the employee even understood the instructions correctly. So yes, the email is evidence, but its evidentiary weight has strict limits. Section 2. The FTX emoji problem. To really understand the real-world stakes of this evidentiary gap, we have to look at how informal systems fail at scale, especially during a crisis. After the collapse of FTX, the incoming CEO actually filed a sworn bankruptcy declaration describing a pretty unusual payment process. Employees were submitting payment requests through a chat platform, and supervisors were approving these disbursements just by responding with personalized emojis. Now, the declaration presented this as a total absence of appropriate controls, not necessarily proof that every single payment was fraudulent. The core issue wasn't that emojis are inherently dangerous. The structural failure was that a completely informal signal was allowed to trigger a formal movement of funds, completely bypassing any robust evidentiary trail. During an investigation, an unpreserved approval becomes an evidentiary void. Sure, a thumbs up or a smiley face might communicate agreement in the moment, but it cannot answer the critical questions. Who actually controlled the account that sent the emoji? Under what specific corporate authority were they operating? Or what exact version of the document were they even looking at when they hit send? Missing communications completely deprive investigators and regulators of the facts. We saw this play out in 2022 when the SEC charged financial firms over $1.1 billion in combined penalties simply because employees conducted business on unpreserved text applications. A decision very well may have happened, but the organization was entirely unable to prove it. Section 3. Calibrating evidentiary weight. And this brilliantly illustrates why, once we understand that informal approvals create a void, our focus really has to shift to how we evaluate the evidence we do manage to recover. Investigators must meticulously categorize their findings layer by layer to avoid manufacturing certainty. The email sitting in the inbox? That is merely the observable artifact. The transmission timestamp? That's your authenticated technical fact. If you pull phone records showing a 2-minute connection, you can make the analytical inference that contact occurred, but that metadata does not prove the content of the conversation. What exact document was discussed remains an unresolved hypothesis. And finally, whether all of this adds up to a valid corporate authorization is a legal determination. You absolutely cannot skip from the observable artifact directly to a legal determination. The objective here isn't to manufacture certainty where none exists. The objective is to define exactly what the evidence supports. A reported approval should never, ever silently become a verified approval in your reports. Precision and attribution might sound a bit less dramatic, but it is vastly more difficult for opposing counsel or auditors to attack. Section 4. The Approval Integrity Test. So, how do we systematically evaluate if an authorization is forensically sound? Before treating any approval as reliable, it must pass a strict 6-layer verification framework. Let's move through this and see how it builds. Layer 1 is identity. Who approved the action directly? A message saying the director approved only identifies the reporter, not the director. Layer 2 is authority. A manager authorized to approve $10,000 does not automatically have authority over $100,000. Identity without authority is meaningless. Layer 3 is the object. What exactly was approved? If an email just says it's approved, but the attached contract was modified 5 minutes later, you've lost version control. And without version control, you cannot establish what the decision actually covered.
The framework is then completed by the final 3 layers. Layer 4 is timing. Sequence matters here. A confirmation created after a payment is executed might just be administrative cleanup, not prior authorization. Layer 5 is independence. A signature isn't enough if one person controls the whole process. The Government Accountability Office once reviewed Veterans Health Administration obligations and found an official who requested, approved, and certified receipt for a single high-dollar transaction. The approval existed, but the independence did not. Finally, Layer 6 is retention. An approval that disappears when a chat account is deleted or when an employee leaves the company is not durable governance. Every single layer must survive verification.
Section 5. Friction-locked workflows. The solution to these vulnerabilities requires a fundamental shift in how organizations view process. Too often, we treat operational friction as an inefficiency that needs to be eliminated. But in reality, controlled friction is a vital security mechanism. To protect high-risk approvals, you have to build workflows where changes automatically force a new decision. Here are 3 practical actions to lock down your process. First, lock fixed document versions using cryptographic hashes so the object of the approval cannot be silently swapped out. Second, automate the verification of approval authority based on the monetary threshold and the specific business entity. And third, strictly require dual authorization above defined risk thresholds. If the amount, the beneficiary, or the document changes after the initial sign-off, the approval must immediately expire. A modified transaction is a new transaction.
Now, what's really fascinating about this dynamic is how modern technology is inadvertently compounding this exact problem. When conducting investigations today, teams are increasingly using artificial intelligence to parse thousands of emails. But AI can accidentally invent direct approvals by flattening the evidentiary distance. Think about it. If you feed a model the reality that the accountant said the manager approved it, the AI will often summarize it simply as the manager approved it. Just like that, one crucial layer of attribution disappears. The AI transformed a secondary, uncorroborated report into a direct, verified fact. Fluent summaries must never be allowed to erase forensic distance.
We return to where we began, but now with a disciplined framework to measure the truth. A verbal approval may be completely legitimate. A reported approval might be highly relevant to your timeline. A cell phone log might corroborate the contact occurred, but none of those artifacts automatically prove the complete authorization story. You must identify the person, the authority, the precise object, the timing, the independence, and the retained record. I leave you with this challenging question to apply to your own networks. If your critical approvals cannot survive this 6-layer integrity test, do you actually have a control in place? Or do you merely have a story about a control? Because during a regulatory investigation, that difference is everything. Semvanski Labs and Research, Forensics over Fiction.